Hey everybody, welcome back from spring break. I hope that this video finds you healthy, safe, and well rested. I'll be taking over from Mr. Heller for the next couple of days to visit some early American literary figures one more time. If you'll remember, before we got into the Constitution and the Great Awakening, we were talking about a guy named Washington Irving. And I told you that Washington Irving was one of the first successful American authors. He was the first American author to be financially successful and make a living through his writing. That his writing was the first commercially successful or commercially accepted American writing that really hit it off in Europe. And he really did lay the groundwork for generations of American authors that came after him. One thing we didn't talk as much about was the fact that while his work was appreciated as entertainment, as being well written by a energetic and personable author, it was not taken very seriously as a literary work or an intellectual work. They looked at it as he was writing ghost stories, basically. If you think about it, the legend of Sleepy Hollow is that headless horseman, the guy with a pumpkin, and he's chasing Ichabod Crane on his horse. And Rip Van Winkle goes up into the mountain, falls asleep for 20 years, wakes up and just wanders back down on his own. These are very fantastic things, right? This isn't serious intellectual writing in the eyes of Europeans. That kind of stuff had to wait for the next generation. Right? And remember, the Europeans had thousands of years head start on this. So for them to look down their noses at a guy like Washington Irving, at least Irving was making a living and he was making money. Other guys weren't. But the group that he inspired and the group that he kind of threw the door open for, that next generation of uniquely American authors, guys like Nathaniel Hawthorne and James Fenimore Cooper, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Walt Whitman. These guys are people who've left a mark on not just American literature, but American culture for the hundreds of years since then. And some of you are going, well, I've never heard of Ralph Waldo Emerson or Walt Whitman or Henry David Thoreau. And maybe you haven't, but you're familiar with ideas that they put forward or things that they've written. One thing you might be hearing about lately, it might have popped up on the news or you might have seen it on the internet, people referring to Walden. Walden is a pond up in Massachusetts where Henry David Thoreau built a little cabin on land owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson, I believe. And he built a little cabin and he went up there and he decided he was going to stay there by himself for 2 years. And he was basically going to be isolated, not for the whole time, but for big chunks of it, learn to be reliant on himself, learn how to live deliberately, have intent in everything that he does. When you're trying to survive in a situation or trying to live in a situation like that, every action has to be deliberate and have a purpose. Because if you're doing things that have no purpose, it's going to get in the way of you doing things that help you survive, really. So Henry David Thoreau goes out there to get in touch with nature, to get in touch with himself, and to really live deliberately and purposefully. And this grows out of a movement called Transcendentalism. Ralph Waldo Emerson, often referred to as the father of American literature. I think that might be more for Washington Irving, in my opinion, but I do understand why people call Ralph Waldo Emerson the father of American literature. He certainly had a pretty big influence. Very talented poet and essayist. He wrote about the idea of self-reliance, about you as the individual being worthy and being able to make for yourself and take care of yourself. And he also is spearheading this movement called Transcendentalism, which was about literature and philosophy and religion and even politics. He had this idea that people in that society and what they considered modern society in the 1830s or so, people that lived in that society, they were no longer original thinkers. All right, they no longer had their own identity. They no longer made their own connection to the universe. All right, the idea of Americans, a collective identity of Americans, was still new, but it was getting to be strong. But the individual identities of Americans, those were things that were weak. All right, it was cookie cutter. Everybody was the same. Everybody thought the same. Everybody behaved the same. Everybody acted the same. There wasn't enough individuality. All right. Transcendentalism meant you had to come up with your original relation and connection to the universe, something that was uniquely you. You had these people around that were doing it with you, but it was something that was uniquely you. All right, and a lot of that had to do with nature, and a lot of that had to do with self-reliance, and a lot of that had to do with unique and personal thought. These guys weren't copying and pasting anything. All right, everything that they wrote was their own. Everything that they said was their own. Everything that they thought was meant to spur some other thought in themselves or even others. All right, these guys were the big time thinkers. But they do kind of go back to some things that we saw earlier. There's that connection to nature that we see in the works of Philip Freneau. We talked about him with the American Revolution, and Freneau writing about geographic features in America, geographic features that were uniquely American. The idea of being an American in the way that Phyllis Wheatley wrote about. Being an American before it was really being an American. This identity that, she was willing to put to the side the fact that these people kept her in servitude as a slave, for the fact that she'd also created this identity as a new or soon-to-be American person. And even Washington Irving using things like the Catskill Mountains. Rip Van Winkle literally goes up into a nature in the Catskill Mountains, sleeps for 20 years, and he comes back the same, but he gets to see how the world has changed. So Emerson and the Transcendental Movement, which you're going to watch a video about in just a moment, were a huge thing at that time. Emerson, in being this kind of father or stepfather to American literature, if you were, he has this idea that we're still creating a uniquely American literature. And he's not just talking about something that's going to be successful commercially, because he doesn't really care if it's successful commercially. He's talking about something that feels American, something that sounds American, something that when people look at it, read it, take it into themselves, they think this is American. And in doing that, he puts out a call in one of his essays, and he says, hey, I want someone to step up. I want someone to be big time and say, I am the first uniquely American poet. Emerson knew it wasn't him. He was good, but he needed somebody that was great. And that's where Walt Whitman comes into things. Ralph Waldo Emerson put out the call, and Walt Whitman, rather emphatically, answered. So you're going to watch a video about Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists right after this. There's also a reading that you'll have to do to be ready for tomorrow. It's a very short excerpt of a Walt Whitman poem. I don't expect you to understand it on your own. We're going to be talking about it in class tomorrow. So finish this Ed puzzle, do the Ralph Waldo Emerson Ed puzzle, and then we will discuss that Walt Whitman poem in class at 9 a.m. tomorrow.